Before we start, kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me, where in the universe are you watching from? Commander Darius Voss stood at the entrance of the massive crystalline hall, his heart pounding in his chest. The air shimmered with energy, the walls pulsing with a soft, golden light. He had faced battlefields, negotiated with warlords, and survived the cold vacuum of space. But none of that compared to this moment. Before him stood the High Tribunal of Vorlix Prime, an ancient council of powerful beings who had never allowed a male of any species into their sacred chambers. The silence in the room was deafening, filled with unspoken judgment. The leader of the tribunal, High Arbiter HFY-SCI, stepped forward. Though Darius had read every available file on the Vorilians, nothing had prepared him for the sheer presence she commanded. Her voice was smooth yet sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. "Commander Voss," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Your arrival marks the first time a male has dared to set foot in the Hall of Judgment. This alone is an offense." Darius resisted the urge to clench his fists. He had been briefed on the Vorilian customs, how they saw males as impulsive, reckless, and unworthy of higher wisdom. But he was here to prove them wrong. "With respect, High Arbiter," Darius said steadily, "I didn't come here to offend. I came to defend. Humanity stands accused of crimes against the galactic order, and I will not allow my people to be judged without representation." A murmur rippled through the tribunal. The Vorilians were telepathic. He could feel their emotions pressing against his mind. Curiosity, skepticism, even surprise. They hadn't expected him to speak with such confidence. HFY-SCI's expression remained unreadable. "You misunderstand, Commander. This is not a negotiation. This is a trial." She gestured toward the glowing emblem above the chamber. "Your presence alone is a test of your kind's worth." Darius exhaled slowly. They were setting him up for failure, a trial without rules, a judgment without fairness. But if there was one thing humanity was good at, it was defying expectations. "Then tell me what I must do," he said, meeting HFY-SCI's gaze without fear. The High Arbiter studied him for a long moment. Then, without looking away, she spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "The trial of purity begins." The floor beneath Darius shifted, the shimmering walls of the hall suddenly vanishing. In the blink of an eye, he was no longer in the tribunal chamber. Instead, he stood in a vast, endless void, a space where time and reality seemed to bend and twist. A voice, HFY-SCI's, but distant, spoke inside his mind. "Survive, if you can." Darius barely had time to react before the air around him rippled. Shapes emerged from the void, shadowy forms with glowing eyes, circling him like hungry predators. His instincts screamed fight, but he knew that was exactly what the tribunal expected. If he lashed out, if he gave in to aggression, he would fail. Instead, he forced himself to remain still. He focused, analyzing the shadows instead of fearing them. Their movements weren't random. They pulsed in sync with something within him. A test of control, a test of mind over instinct. Darius inhaled deeply, slowing his heartbeat, calming his thoughts. The shadows hesitated. He exhaled. They recoiled. And then they vanished. The void shattered like glass, and he was back in the tribunal hall. The silence was heavier now, the gazes of the Vorilians unreadable. HFY-SCI stepped forward. This time, there was something different in her expression. Not anger, not superiority. Something closer to intrigue. "Perhaps," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, "this trial will not be as predictable as I thought." Darius Voss stood in the center of the tribunal hall, his breath steady, his mind sharp. The Vorilians, still silent, studied him with intense, unreadable gazes. The first trial had tested his control over instinct, his ability to resist fear. He had passed, but he knew this was only the beginning. High Arbiter HFY-SCI took a slow step forward. "You handled the first trial well, Commander Voss. perhaps too well. Her voice carried a note of curiosity, as if she had expected him to fail. Darius met her gaze. Humanity doesn't break as easily as you think. A faint murmur passed through the tribunal. HFY-SCI held up a hand, silencing them. Very well. Let us see if you can prove that. She lifted her chin. The next trial will test your integrity. Before Darius could respond, the world around him shifted again. The tribunal hall blurred, the golden light dimming into darkness. When his vision cleared, he found himself in a completely different place. A great endless bridge stretched before him, made of smooth, polished stone. The air was still, heavy with expectation. On either side of the bridge, there was nothing. Only a deep, vast abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. And at the center of the bridge stood two figures. One was a human woman, Dr. Leora Hayes, a brilliant scientist who had worked alongside him in the diplomatic corps. She looked at him with wide eyes, her expression filled with uncertainty. The other was a young Vorelian girl, barely more than a child. She stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her, watching him with an eerie calm. Then, HFY-SCI's voice echoed through the space. Commander Voss, one of them will fall. You may only save one. Darius stiffened. His mind raced. What kind of trial is this? A test of choice, HFY-SCI said. A test of your values. The bridge trembled. Beneath the feet of the two figures, the stone began to crack. One of them would fall in moments. Dr. Hayes took a step toward him, panic rising in her voice. Darius, please. The Vorelian girl did not speak. She only watched, unafraid, as the stone beneath her crumbled. Darius' heart pounded. He could not let either of them die. But saving both wasn't an option, at least, not in the way the tribunal expected. The cracks spread faster. He had seconds to act. Then an idea struck him. The Vorelians wanted him to choose between loyalty and innocence, between saving his own kind or proving his commitment to the galactic order. But what if the real test wasn't about the choice itself, but about defying it? Darius moved. With a burst of speed, he ran toward the center of the bridge, toward the weakened stone between them. As the bridge began to collapse, he leaped forward, grabbing both Dr. Hayes and the Vorelian girl at once. The ground vanished beneath them. For a split second, they fell, but just as quickly, Darius twisted his body, using the momentum to push them back toward stable ground. With a final, desperate effort, he threw them forward, out of danger. He, however, was still falling. The abyss rushed toward him, the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. But then, the world froze. Everything stilled, as if time itself had stopped. The scene shattered like glass. Darius found himself standing back in the tribunal hall. The bridge, the abyss, Dr. Hayes, and the child were all gone. The trial had been an illusion, a test of his decisions, and he had refused to choose only one. The tribunal members were no longer silent. A mixture of astonishment, confusion, and quiet admiration passed through them. None of them had expected this. HFY-SCI's eyes remained locked on Darius. This time, she did not mask her expression. Intrigue. Respect. Something else. You would sacrifice yourself rather than submit to the test, she asked, her voice softer now. Darius exhaled. I don't accept false choices. Humanity doesn't leave people behind. HFY-SCI studied him for a long moment. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her hand. The second trial is complete. A murmur of disbelief spread through the tribunal. Darius clenched his fists. He had survived another test. But he knew the hardest trial was still ahead. Darius Voss stood tall in the tribunal hall, his breathing steady despite the weight of the trials he had faced. He had passed 2 impossible tests, trials designed to break him, to prove humanity's supposed inferiority. Yet here he was, still standing, defying expectations. Around him, the Vorelian tribunal members murmured in hushed tones, their telepathic energy buzzing like a silent storm. They had never seen a male of any species succeed in these trials, and neither had High Arbiter Laura. She stepped forward, studying him with an unreadable expression. "You continue to surprise us, Commander Voss," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it, something curious. Darius met her gaze without hesitation. "Then maybe it's time to rethink what you believe about humanity." A flicker of something passed over Tylura's face, but she quickly masked it. "Your third trial begins now," she declared, her voice resonating through the chamber. "This is the trial of endurance." Before Darius could respond, the golden walls around him flickered and vanished. In the blink of an eye, he was no longer in the tribunal hall. Instead, he stood in a vast desert, a place of endless dooms beneath a scorching twin sun. The heat was suffocating, the air thick and dry. There was nothing around him, no shelter, no water, no sign of escape. Then Tylura's voice echoed through his mind. "You must survive." Darius clenched his jaw. A test of endurance. They wanted to see how long he could last before breaking. He took a slow breath and began walking. The heat pressed down on him, each step draining his energy. His uniform was designed for space travel, not for surviving an alien wasteland, but he refused to give in. He had endured worse. He would endure this. Hours passed. His throat grew dry. His limbs felt heavy. Still, he kept moving. Then, on the horizon, he saw it, a figure. Someone else was in the desert. As he got closer, he recognized the shape of Tylura. She stood calmly, as if unaffected by the heat. "You are struggling," she observed. Darius wiped sweat from his brow. "I've had worse days." Her head tilted slightly. "Why do you keep going?" He exhaled. "Because stopping isn't an option." Tylura studied him for a long moment. Then, with a flick of her hand, the desert vanished. Darius gasped as cool air rushed over him. He was back in the tribunal hall, standing exactly where he had started. The desert had not been real. But the pain, the exhaustion, that had been very real. The tribunal members murmured again, their energy shifting. None of them had expected him to last this long. Tylura took a slow step forward. For the first time, her voice was not cold, not distant. "You endured the impossible without complaint. You pushed forward when others would have given up." She paused. "You are unlike any male we have encountered before." Darius breathed deeply. He could feel it now, the shift in the air, the change in her tone. For the first time, Tylura was no longer just testing him. She was watching him, studying him, and perhaps something more. "The third trial is complete," she said softly. The tribunal had tried to break him, but instead, Darius was breaking them. Darius Voss stood tall, his body still aching from the brutal endurance trial. He had walked through an illusionary desert, felt the heat, the pain, the exhaustion, and yet he had never stopped moving. Now, back in the tribunal hall, he could see it in their eyes. Doubt, hesitation. The Varillian judges had expected him to fail. But he hadn't. High Arbiter Tylura observed him in silence, her expression unreadable. But something was different. She was not looking at him as an unworthy outsider anymore. She was seeing him. Finally, she spoke. "You have proven your resilience, Commander Voss. But endurance is only one part of strength. A leader must also know when to rely on others." She raised a hand, and the golden light in the tribunal hall flickered. "The fourth trial is trust." Darius tensed as the world around him shifted again. When his vision cleared, he found himself in a darkened corridor, metal walls surrounding him. A distant alarm blared, flashing red lights bathing everything in an ominous glow. The air smelled of smoke and fire, a ship in crisis. Then, a voice. "Commander, help me." Darius turned sharply. Dr. Leora Hayes was pinned beneath a collapsed beam, her breathing ragged. Sparks rained from above, and the floor beneath her was beginning to crack, ready to give way into the void of space. But before Darius could move, another sound caught his ear. A soft, almost breathless whisper. "Help." He spun around. Further down the corridor, barely visible in the flickering red light, was a Vorelian woman, not a warrior, not a judge, just an ordinary citizen. She clutched a deep wound on her side, her strength fading. If he didn't reach her soon, she wouldn't survive. Darius' mind raced. 2 lives. 2 different paths. The tribunal wanted to see his choice. Would he save his own kind, the woman he knew, the scientist who had worked beside him? Or would he save a Vorelian, proving that he could place his trust in those outside his species? He refused to choose. "Hold on," he shouted to both women. He moved fast, his soldier instincts kicking in. He reached Dr. Hayes first, gripping the heavy beam pinning her down. With a grunt, he lifted it just enough for her to crawl free. But there was no time to rest. The floor beneath the Vorelian was cracking apart. Darius sprinted. The moment he reached her, the floor gave way. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist just as she fell. His muscles screamed in protest, but he held on. "I've got you," he gritted out. The Vorelian woman's eyes widened. She had expected him to let go, to abandon her for the human. But he didn't. With one last effort, he hauled her up. As soon as her feet hit solid ground, the world vanished. Darius gasped, suddenly standing back in the tribunal hall. The ship, the fire, the chaos, all gone. It had been another illusion, another test. Silence filled the room. The Vorelian judges looked at him, their telepathic energy buzzing with something new. Respect. Tylera's gaze lingered on him. Then, for the first time, she spoke in a voice that was almost soft. "You trusted where others would not." A pause. "And you did not abandon either one." Darius exhaled. "Because that's what we do." Something flickered in her expression. A tension in the air. A shift neither of them fully understood. But something between them was changing. "The 4th trial," Tylera said at last, "is complete. And none of them would ever see him the same way again." Darius Voss stood in the center of the tribunal hall, his breath steady despite the weight of the last trial. The Vorelian judges sat in silence, their usual cold expressions tinged with something different, something uncertain. They had expected him to struggle, to fail. But he hadn't. He had endured. He had proven himself. And now something unspoken hung in the air. High Arbiter Tylera studied him, her sharp gaze unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, yet laced with something new. "You have passed 4 trials, Commander Voss," she said. "Your strength, your endurance, and your loyalty have been tested." Darius nodded, waiting. He could feel it, a shift in the way they looked at him. "God, Lyra to this, step forward. But now we must see if you can truly understand us." The hall dimmed, golden light flickering like fire. Then everything changed. Darius gasped as the world around him shifted. One moment, he was in the tribunal hall. The next, he stood in the middle of a Vorelian city, towering structures stretched high above, glowing with soft blue energy. The air was rich with strange, beautiful scents, and the distant hum of alien voices filled the space. This was real, not an illusion. He had been brought here. Before him stood Tylera. But for the first time, she was not standing as a judge. She was standing as something more. "This," she said, motioning to the city, "is my home." Darius turned slowly, taking it all in. He had read about Vorelian architecture, about their society, but being here, feeling the pulse of their world, was different. Tylera watched him carefully. "This trial is not one of strength," she said. "It is one of understanding. You have fought, endured, and resisted. Now, you must listen. Darius met her gaze. And if I fail? Her expression softened slightly. Then you will never truly know us. For the first time, it wasn't a challenge. It was something else. An invitation. She turned, walking forward. Come, she said. Darius hesitated only a moment before following. As they walked through the city, the stairs followed him. Vorelians of all ranks and roles paused as they passed, their glowing eyes watching him with curiosity, with caution. Darius was the first human to walk these streets. He felt the weight of it, but more than that, he felt her presence beside him. They passed through a grand marketplace, where alien merchants sold goods from across the stars. They moved past a training ground, where young Vorelians practiced combat, their movements precise and deadly. But it wasn't until they reached the Garden of Stars that HFY-SCI stopped. The garden was vast, filled with bioluminescent plants that shimmered under a dark sky. It was breathtaking. This place is sacred to us, HFY-SCI said quietly. It is where our greatest leaders have come to reflect. Darius nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. He looked at her, seeing something beyond the judge, the warrior. He saw the person. You've seen my strength, he said. But what do you see now? HFY-SCI held his gaze for a long time. And then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. The same thing you see in me, she said softly. Something shifted between them. A silent understanding. A connection neither of them had expected. The fifth trial was not one of endurance or combat. It was the beginning of something far greater. Darius Voss stood beside High Arbiter HFY-SCI in the Garden of Stars, surrounded by shimmering alien plants and the soft glow of the Vorelian sky. There was a stillness between them, not tense, not uncertain, but something undeniable, a quiet understanding. He had fought, he had endured, he had proven his strength. But this moment, this was different. You expected me to fail, Darius said finally, his voice even. HFY-SCI didn't deny it. I expected you to be like the others. The others? She turned, her expression unreadable. The few males from other species who came before you. They sought conquest. They sought control. Her gaze locked onto his. You are not like them. Darius exhaled slowly. He had spent his life proving humanity's worth to the galaxy, but this felt different. He wasn't just proving himself. He was changing something between them. HFY-SCI studied him for a moment longer before motioning for him to follow. There is one last place I must show you, she said. They walked through the heart of the city, where towering spires pulsed with blue energy. The streets were quieter here, the hum of the city distant. HFY-SCI led him into a massive chamber, a place of history, of law. A hall of ancients. Golden glyphs lined the walls, shifting and glowing as if alive, telling the story of the Vorelian people. She turned to him. Do you know why Vorelian women rule? Darius folded his arms. I've read theories. That males were once in power, but they fell to corruption. Her expression was solemn. Not just corruption. War, betrayal, destruction. She walked forward, tracing a hand over the glowing glyphs. A time came when our people could no longer trust them. The damage they caused nearly shattered our world. Darius nodded, understanding the weight of her words. But then she turned to him, stepping closer. And yet, she said softly, you stand here, proving that history does not decide the future. Something in her voice made his heart pound. She wasn't speaking as a judge. She wasn't speaking as a warrior. She was speaking as HFY-SCI, not just a leader, not just a Vorelian, but a woman seeing him as something different. Darius held her gaze. And what does that mean? For the first time, she hesitated. The High Arb, Darius Voss, stood in the Hall of Ancients, the golden glyphs glowing softly around him. The chamber was silent, but the air between him and High Arbiter HFY-SCI was charged with something unspoken. She had led him here, not just to show him the history of her people, but to test something deeper, to test him. "I was taught that men cannot be trusted," HFY-SCI said, her voice measured, "that no male of any species could ever understand our ways." She took a slow step forward. "Yet here you stand." Darius met her gaze without hesitation, because trust isn't given, it's earned. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Doubt, deception, weakness. But she found none. Instead, she found a man who had fought for more than survival. He had fought for respect. She sighed, breaking the silence. "There is one final test." Darius exhaled. He should have expected this. "What is it?" HFY-SCI turned away, looking at the ancient glyphs that told the story of her people. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "You must stand before the Great Council and make your case." Darius frowned. "Make my case." She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "You have passed every trial, but the decision is not mine alone." Something in her eyes flickered, hesitation. For the first time, Darius saw it. This wasn't just about tradition. It wasn't just about proving his strength. This was about her too. She had brought him here. She had guided him through the trials. And now she had to decide whether she was willing to stand with him, to go against centuries of belief. Darius took a step closer. "And what do you believe, HFY-SCI?" Her breath caught for just a second. Then she answered, her voice softer than before. "I believe you are unlike any other." The words lingered between them. It was not a confession. It was not a declaration. But it was something. Darius felt the weight of it, of everything unspoken between them. For the first time, she was not just the high arbiter. She was a woman standing at the edge of something unknown. And so was he. After a long pause, she turned away. "Tomorrow, you will stand before the council. They will decide your fate." Darius exhaled, knowing this was the final battle. But as he looked at her, he realized something else. She was not just testing him. She was testing herself. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what the answer would be. Darius Voss stood in the center of the great council chamber, facing a half-circle of Aurelian judges. Their glowing eyes regarded him with scrutiny, their expressions carved from stone. The chamber itself felt ancient, the towering pillars lined with golden glyphs that pulsed softly, as if alive. This was the final test, the final judgment. Behind him, HFY-SCI stood in silence. She had led him through the trials, guided him through their world, but now she could not speak for him. This moment was his alone. The chief arbiter, an elder Aurelian with an aura of unquestionable authority, finally spoke. "Commander Voss," she said, her voice cold and sharp, "you have survived our trials. You have proven your strength, your endurance, your loyalty. But one truth remains." The chamber darkened slightly as she leaned forward. "No male has ever been granted status among our kind. No male has ever stood where you now stand." Murmurs rippled through the council, some in agreement, others in doubt. Darius remained still. He had expected this. Then the chief arbiter's gaze turned piercing. Why should that change? The question echoed through the chamber. A challenge. A test far greater than any trial of endurance or combat. Darius took a slow breath. He could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing against him. But he didn't falter. He looked each of them in the eye, then spoke. "Because strength is not just about power," he said, his voice steady. "It is not about conquest or control. It is about trust. It is about standing together, not as rulers and the ruled, but as equals." Some judges frowned. Others leaned in, listening. Darius continued. "I have fought beside your people. I have bled for your trials, and I have seen what you fear." He met the chief arbiter's gaze directly. "You do not fear men. You fear the past." A silence fell over the chamber. The words struck deep. "You believe that to change is to invite ruin. Darius went on. But if we never change, we remain trapped in the same cycle, never growing, never moving forward. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he made his final stand. I am not here to take. I am not here to demand. He turned slightly, glancing at Tylara. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as a judge, but as something more. I am here because I was invited. The tension in the room was palpable. The chief arbiter sat back, considering. The murmurs returned, some voices uncertain, others intrigued. Then, after a long silence, the chief arbiter spoke. High Arbiter HFY-SCI, she said. What is your judgment? Darius turned slightly, his heart pounding. This was it. The decision was hers. HFY-SCI stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was firm. Commander Voss has done what no other has, she said. He has earned his place. More whispers, more uncertainty. But then, a single chime rang through the chamber, a signal of finality. The chief arbiter stood. Then it is decided. She met Darius' gaze, something almost respectful in her expression. You will be the first. Darius exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. He had done it. He had changed history. As the council dismissed, HFY-SCI turned to him, her voice quieter than before. You spoke the truth, she said, and for that, you were heard. Darius looked at her, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something new, something undeniable. You believed in me, he said. HFY-SCI didn't answer immediately. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, she simply said, I do now. And in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning.